to this, but really I wanted to talk about the injuries I've seen around the NFL. I don't know about all of you, but to me, it seems like there's a lot of major impact players that are injured right now. I'll name a few. Right, obviously Joe Burrow I think would be number one on that list. That obviously wasn't this past week, but Joe Burrow most likely will be out for most of the season. Maybe coming back mid to late December. He's just one of them. We saw this past week two major running backs go down. Losing James Conner for the Cardinals is a big deal. They do have Trey Benson. I think Trey Benson will be the one, that carries the heaviest load with James Conner going down. But that's really going to impact a team like the Cardinals. We also saw Najee Harris go down, and I feel really bad for Najee Harris. He obviously had, that freak firework accident where it injured his eye, but the Chargers are a really good team, and Najee Harris not being able to be out there on the field, does make the Chargers a little bit less deadly. Makes them a little bit less scary. People don't really understand the fact that Najee Harris has been a consecutive 1,000-yard runner since he's been in the NFL. The Steelers did let Najee Harris go, but at the same time, he was a solid running back. They decided they needed to pay other players, and they were banking on the fact that Jaylen Warren was going to have the year that he's so far had. I will say that. But, again, Najee Harris being out, that puts a lot of pressure on a rookie running back in Omarion Hampton. I'm a fan of Omarion Hampton. I think he's going to be able to handle this. But you still have to wonder, as you get later on into the season, if something were to happen to, Omarion Hampton, who's going to be that guy? I was taking a look at it, and it looks to me like they did sign Hassan Haskins, but Hassan Haskins isn't a three-down back by any means. He's being picked up off the streets, and so losing someone like that, it really does impact, that Chargers team. We also saw Mike Evans go down with a hamstring injury. They have a really tough matchup this week. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we'll talk about this more as we go on, but the Buccaneers play the Eagles this week. That is not an easy game whatsoever. And when you don't have Mike Evans and also Chris Godwin is still out, that's going to cause some problems. I'm a huge fan of this Buccaneers team. I think Baker Mayfield is proving everyone wrong. I know this is his third year with the Buccaneers, so this isn't something new. But you could really tell that he's taken a leadership role in that locker room. His energy is infectious. I love how he's joking around with rookie Emeka Egbuka. Emeka Egbuka, now that I mention him, we obviously have to say, he's really going to have to step up, and he's obviously not even that healthy either. So, Emeka Egbuka being out there, you need him to stay as healthy as possible for this to really work. To me, CeeDee Lamb going down is what's going to make or break, the Cowboys for a couple of weeks. I think they're expecting him to be out anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, most likely somewhere closer to 4 weeks. And so, again, that's going to have a major impact. So I did want to talk about these injuries because they are starting to pile up in the NFL. Everyone says this. You have 100%, there's a 100% guarantee you're going to get injured. The level of injury is another aspect of that. But this is a physical game still. I know that they've really softened the game up a lot, but these injuries are happening, and injuries I'm seeing more often are these Achilles injuries. To me, I believe James Conner had an Achilles injury, and I know Najee Harris has an ankle injury as well. They didn't necessarily specify if it was Achilles or not, or maybe I have it backwards. Maybe it's Najee Harris has the Achilles injury and James Conner just has an ankle injury, but you're seeing a lot of Achilles issues in this game or in this season, and I'm kind of curious about that. Has anyone else noticed the fact that there's just so many injuries happening, especially Achilles injuries happening? That's something to me that I feel like it's becoming more and more common. I was listening to the Bussin' with the Boys podcast, and they were actually talking about this issue last week, and it was interesting what they said, and I think there's some truth to this. These athletes, they're becoming bigger, they're becoming faster, and they're becoming stronger. But the parts of the body that are not getting bigger and faster and stronger are your tendons, are your ligaments, like your Achilles, your ACL. These things are not getting stronger as humans become more and more athletic. These players are running faster and faster every year in the 40. They're getting bigger, they're getting stronger. And so you have like these, I would call almost like sports car sorts of bodies, but under the hood, there's still, a Honda or a Toyota engine or like spark plugs. There's aspects of the body that, just haven't been able to progress as much as the rest of their bodies. And so they're getting more wear and tear. That's the only thing I can think of as to why this is happening more and more. Has anyone else though noticed this? Has anyone else seen this? Because again, to me, these Achilles injuries especially are just becoming more and more common. Hamstring as well. Hamstring issues pop up all the time. And those are a finicky injury. You never know when you're going to be fully healed from that. It could be, a week, but it could also be something like, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And you just never really know. And it impacts the season. It impacts these teams. So again, that's a lot of injuries that I've talked about, right? Again, Najee Harris, James Conner. We're talking about Nick Bosa. I didn't even bring up Nick Bosa yet. Nick Bosa, he tore his ACL. They were hopeful that it wasn't going to be a torn ACL, but Nick Bosa, he's out for the season now for the 49ers, who just can't seem to find a way to get healthy. Every single week they continue to win, but every single week they lose a major player. Brock Purdy might be able to come back this week, but they're still going to be without George Kittle. Brandon Ayuk is still coming off of an injury. And then again, you also have now Nick Bosa. Your biggest impact player on the defensive side besides Fred Warner is now out. So again, these injuries are starting to pile up, and we're just now getting to week 4. That's crazy to think about. Like, we are just 3 weeks through the season right now. Thursday night will mark the beginning of week 4. And so, again, these injuries, I'm sure I say this every year, people think this every year, but to me, there's just a lot more injuries this year than I've ever really seen.